Gardevoir. Whether you love this Pokemon or hate it, it's maintained a huge amount of popularity despite not being the best Pokemon in its base form throughout the generations. I wonder why that is. Still, when it comes to the Pokemon card game, the viability of a Mon only comes down to what's printed on the card. So did Gardy manage to shine there? Spoilers, yes it did. Gardevoir is commonly accepted as one of the best Pokemon in TCG, getting multiple cards that have been game-defining in their day. But why was it so good? To figure that out, I've decided to break down every Gardevoir card printed thus far, i.e. through Sun and Moon, and see what made this Psychic Fairy a force to be reckoned with. Also, up until Gen 6, I'm going to skip over the stage, typing, retreat cost, and weakness for all of the cards, because they're all the same, with the cards being a 2-stage Psychic typing, 2 retreat, and the weakness to Psychic. If that ever changes, I'll mention it. Otherwise, just assume they all hold true.
Alright, Gardevoir, it's time. Let's show the fans a spectacular battle! Gardevoir.
The first Gardevoir card comes out of the first expansion to have Gen 3 Pokemon in it, EX Ruby and Sapphire. EX Ruby and Sapphire's Gardevoir has a Pokepower where, once during your turn, before you attack, you may search your deck for a Psychic Energy card that's attached to one of your Pokemon. Put 2 damage counters on that Pokemon. Shuffle your deck afterwards. This power cannot be used if Gardevoir is affected by a special condition. It also has an attack, Energy Burst, for a cost of 1 Psychic. It does 10 damage times the total amount of energy attached to Gardevoir and the defending Pokemon. The effect is good, allowing for good energy acceleration, and combined with the attack, it actually worked really well as a good check to the Firestarter Blaziken that was ruling the meta at the time. The cost of only 1 Psychic Energy was nice too, as the main point would be to punish your opponent for stacking energy on, as much as it was to put on energy yourself. While the attack was pretty nice, the main reason people came to this card, the main reason for this card being the backbone of Gardevoir decks for the rest of the gen, was its energy acceleration. This card was featured heavily in a World Championship deck. Despite being frail and its attack not being the most threatening, it paired excellently with our next card. EX Sandstorm was the first set to feature Evolution Pokemon EX, so of course Gardevoir was one of the Pokemon to get one. It also has a weakness to Grass. For the life of me, I can't figure that one out. It also has 150 HP, making it a lot more bulky than the other Gardevoir card. Its first attack, Feedback, for the cost of a Psychic and a Colorless, states, count the number of cards in your opponent's hand, then put that many damage counters on the defending Pokemon. Its second attack, Psystorm, for the cost of a Psychic and 3 Colorless, does 10 damage times the total amount of energy attached to all Pokemon in play. That's right, it's just the attack of Vanilla Guardy, but with all the energy in play, as opposed to just both actives. This worked amazingly with its non-EX counterpart, as getting multiple Guardies on the field meant a flood of energy powering up this card. The cost of Psychic and 3 Colorless was kind of steep, but with base Guardy it allowed you to accelerate energy onto any Pokemon, not just itself. Plus there was also boost and later scramble energy, allowing this card even easier access to get rolling. These 2 cards marked the first of many appearances on the top tables of Worlds for Guardy, but Gen 3 wasn't all amazing. Unfortunately, the next Guardy card wasn't nearly as successful. Gardevoir EX Emerald had a Pokepower called Heal Dance, which states, once per turn, before you attack, you may remove 2 damage counters from one of your Pokemon. You can't use more than 1 Heal Dance Pokepower per turn. This power can't be used if Gardevoir is affected by a special condition. Its first attack, Psy Punch, costs a Psychic and a Colorless and does 30 damage. Its second attack, Mind Shock, costs a Psychic and 3 Colorless and does 60 damage, and this attack's damage isn't affected by weakness or resistance. Yeah, coming off the great energy acceleration and power of the last 2 cards, this is pretty underwhelming. Healing 20 damage per turn is pretty irrelevant in a meta where most of the best cards were looking to one-hit KO you, which didn't give you a ton of time to apply band-aids. It's also just not a lot, seeing as 2 years ago the same Pokemon was fine with putting those damage counters on just to attach energy. Its attacks let it down hard too. Doing 30 damage on a stage 2 is just a waste of your turn, and doing 60 damage is okay, but seeing as things like Dark Tyranitar were smashing for 120, it just wasn't enough to keep up with the competition. But this was just a small blip on Guardy's radar. It wasn't done with 3rd gen yet. Arguably one of the best decks in the Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald era would involve the first set's Gardevoir and the next 2 cards. The next cards are weird, as they're both Gardevoir as Delta Pokemon. These were something done at the end of the GBA era of the game. Many of these Pokemon, including Gardy, are the type they'd normally be on the card, plus some other funky typing. The explanation for this was that Pokemon become Delta species upon exposure to electromagnetic waves, which were produced by scientists in Holland attempting to locate Mew. Now you can't blame him, because Mew's a pretty good card in this generation. Anyways, the first Delta Pokemon is Gardevoir Delta from EX Delta species. Its Pokepower, Energy Jump, states that once per turn, before you attack, you may move an energy card attached to one of your Pokemon to another one of your Pokemon. This power can't be used if Gardevoir is affected by a special condition. Its first attack, Psychic Rage, for a Steel and a Colorless, choose one of your opponent's Pokemon. This attack does 10 damage for each damage counter on Gardevoir to that Pokemon. Don't apply weakness and resistance for benched Pokemon. Second attack, hey wait, Yu-Gi-Oh's gotta call Black Magician Dark Magician, but we get a Black Magic in Pokemon? Oh, whatever. Anyways, Black Magic, for a Psychic and 2 Colorless, does 10 damage plus 20 more times the number of your opponent's benched Pokemon. Bouncing one energy around in the Age of Weavile doesn't seem that impressive, but combined with the Pokepower to accelerate energy from the first Gardy, it could tank the damage counters necessary to bring that energy out and move the energy to an attacking Pokemon that could stay healthy and swing hard. It could also move into the active and give a beatdown with Psychic Rage when it has enough damage stacked on it. The last and arguably most important part of the deck was another Delta card from the last Delta Series expansion. The Gardevoir EX Delta from EX Dragon Frontiers has a Pokepower, Imprison, which states the following. Once per turn, before you attack, if Gardevoir EX is your active Pokemon, you may put an Imprison marker on one of your opponent's Pokemon. Any Pokemon that has an Imprison marker on it can't use any Pokepowers or Pokebodies. This power can't be used if Gardevoir EX is affected by a special condition. Its attack, Flame Ball, for a Fire and 2 Colorless, is 80 damage. You can move a Fire energy attached to Gardevoir EX to one of your benched Pokemon. Anyone who's heard the name Garbotoxin can tell you, ability negation is one of the most useful things in Pokemon, and this made Gardevoir Delta EX one of the best ways to shut down what most decks were using for their engine at the time, Pidgeot, and his Quick Search Pokepower. Its attack wasn't used a ton, as if you were running in a deck you'd probably be using Metal and Psychic Energy as opposed to Fire, but that didn't matter though. If you were coming to this Gardevoir, you were coming for its ability, which led it to being one of the most predominant lockdown decks of all time. A good way to end Gen 3, but Gardy was just getting started. If you know anything about Gardevoir's presence in the Pokemon card game, it probably involves the next card, as it's one of the most iconic Gardevoir cards ever printed. Gardevoir from Diamond and Pearl Secret Wonders has a Pokepower Telepass, which states, once per turn, before you attack, you may search your opponent's discard pile for a supporter card, then use the effect of that card as this effect of this power. The supporter card remains in the opponent's discard pile. You can't use more than one Telepass Pokepower per turn. This power can't be used if Gardevoir is affected by a special condition. Its attack, Psychic Lock, for 1 Psychic and 2 Colorless, does 60 damage and states that during your opponent's next turn, your opponent cannot use any Pokepowers on his or her Pokemon. It's also level 55, yeah, remember when Pokemon used to do that? Right off the bat, the ability and attack are both amazing. Stealing your opponent's supporter's abilities and basically giving you 2 per turn is something that would be fantastic today, let alone in 2007. It would be upstaged by some other cards later down the line that didn't have the hard once per turn effect, but it's still fantastic. The attack also made Lockdown a tier 1 contender. The damage threatens a 2-hit KO on most of the meta-relevant Pokemon, and locking down your opponent out of Uxie's setup and Claydol's Cosmic Power, otherwise known as the 2 biggest draw engines for the format, was amazing. Also remember, cards like Broken Time Space and Rare Candy made setting up these Pokemon way easier. Gardy also took advantage of Scramble Energy to power up in 1 turn when it was behind on prizes. With this and the strong Gallade at the time, Gardevoir basically ruled the 2007 and 2008 season, with Gallade being an early game attacker while Gardevoir got set up, and then coming to Psychic Lock your opponent for the rest of the game. This deck was the one to beat coming into Worlds, and despite people bringing counters, it still managed to win the Masters division, alongside a little bit of help from our next card. Gardevoir Level X from Secret Wonders. It has the normal Level X text that states, put this card onto an active Gardevoir. Gardevoir Level X can now use any attack, Pokepower, or Pokebody from the previous level. Its Pokepower states that once during your turn, before you attack, choose one of your active Pokemon or your benched Pokemon, and switch Gardevoir with that Pokemon. The power can't be used if Gardevoir is affected by a special condition. Its only attack, Bring Down, for 2 Psychic says, choose one Pokemon, yours or your opponent's, with the fewest remaining HP, excluding Gardevoir, and that Pokemon is now knocked out. This card was a great one-of in most Guardy Gallade decks, also called Plox for Psychic Lock, hey I don't make the rules, and was mostly tasked with cleanup. It could always gust itself in or out of the active Pokemon position to make sure that it stays alive, to use Vanilla Guardy's support ability. It was a fantastic card, but how much of that was based on its non-level X counterpart isn't really the point. The point is that the card that this deck was put in put Gardevoir on the map as one of the TCG's premier Pokemon. Unfortunately, the final card in Guardy's Gen 4 run did not live up to the standard that is set by the previous ones. Gardevoir from Platinum is a 120 HP Pokemon with only 1 retreat this time. Unfortunately, the retreat cost must have been equivalent exchange for its very underwhelming attacks. The ability Psychic Connect, which states as often as you like during your turn, before you attack, you may move a Psychic Energy attached to one of your benched Pokemon to your active Pokemon. This power can't be used if Gardevoir is affected by a special condition. Its first attack, Energy Burst, costs 1 Psychic Energy. It does 20 damage, plus 10 more for each energy attached to Gardevoir and the defending Pokemon. Its second attack, Psychic Protection, does 60 damage. Gardevoir has no weakness during your opponent's next turn. It's not horrible, but energy moving on a stage 2 is just kind of clunky at this point. The Energy Burst attack wasn't really relevant in a meta with threats like Torkoal and Gengar running around, only attaching 2 energy to attack. Second attack is pretty rough, honestly. 60 is just not strong enough at this point, and removing your weakness doesn't really mean a lot when Gengar just needs one more trainer to KO you with Poltergeist. Overall, it's not a bad card, but it's the far cry from the glory that the previous 2 had. The Gen 4 hangover must have hit Guardy hard, because the Gen 5 representation she got was really overshadowed by other Psychic Pokemon, like Mewtwo EX. Still, she got some notable support. Gardevoir from Next Destinies has 110 HP and 2 retreat cost again. Glad everything's back to normal. Its ability, Psychic Mirage, states that each basic Psychic Energy attached to your Psychic Pokemon provides 2 Psychic Energy. You can't apply more than 1 Psychic Mirage ability at a time. Her first attack, Mind Shock, costs 2 Psychics and 2 Colorless, and does 60 damage. This attack isn't affected by weakness or resistance. This is so close to being a good card. Doubling Psychic Energy to 2 Psychics is amazing, and it cut setup time in half for most Pokemon, but the attack is what really lets it down. Like I said before, 60 damage with no modifiers is just not going to cut it anymore, especially on a stage 2. Also, because of that stage 2-ness, it didn't really function well as a support Pokemon either. Throw in a Psychic weakness, which made it trash against the aforementioned Mewtwo, and you have a card for a recipe with potential, but was crushed by everything but its ability. Fun fact, this is probably the most expensive Gardevoir card, costing about $60 in its Dark Explorers reprint. Nothing important here, just thought it was weird that such an underwhelming card costs so much. At least we're not paying that much for standard staples, right guys? Anyways, Gardevoir from Legendary Treasures. It has 120 HP and 1 retreat. Its first attack, Psybeam, costs a Psychic and a Colorless, does 40 damage, and the defending Pokemon is now confused. Its second attack, for 2 Psychic, Eternal Radiance, allows you to move all damage counters from this Pokemon to the defending Pokemon. This Pokemon can't use Eternal Radiance during the next turn. Oof, this one's not very good. They say one man's trash is another man's treasure, but I'm pretty sure this is just trash. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, because it's super nothing. The first attack is weak and applies more of a mild annoyance than an actual hindrance to your opponent in confusion. And the second attack is good if you were asleep and realize that your opponent's been attacking your Guardy this whole game. The inability to use it the following turn is simultaneously the reason this card isn't broken and the reason it's utter garbage, as pretty much every meta-relevant deck was probably able to KO your Guardy in 2 turns. People didn't play this in 2013, and you shouldn't think about it in 2019. Moving on. Gen 5 was a weird one for Gardevoir, as its goth sister took up the item locking role for this generation. things wouldn't stay stagnant for long, as the next generation brought a lot of changes to Gardevoir. From here on out, Gardy switched from being Psychic type to always being Fairy type in at least one of its typings. This is likely because to Game Freak, despite being made 3 generations before the type existed, Gardy is pretty much the poster gal for fairies. Because of this, we also see Gardevoir shift from the control style of gameplay to something a little bit more offensive, as we see in her first card. Gardevoir EX from Primal Clash is a 170 HP Fairy type, and the basic EX rule that when you KO this card, you take 2 prizes. Its first attack, Life Leap, for 1 Fairy Energy, does 20 damage, and states, heal from this Pokemon the same amount of damage you did from your opponent's Pokemon. Its second attack, for 3 Fairy Energy, is Shining Wind. It does 100 damage, and states, during your opponent's next turn, this Pokemon has no weakness. The basic EX Pokemon in this era were more of a stepping stone to their Mega Evolutions than actually good cards in their own right. It's still totally passable. Life Leap is something that you'll probably never use unless it's your first turn, and Shining Wind is pretty expensive, so you'll probably never get to use it, instead opting to utilize the form this basic was made to facilitate. Mega Gardevoir EX from Primal Clash. It's a Mega Pokemon with 210 HP, has the EX rule, and the Mega Evolution rule, stating that when one of your Pokemon becomes a Mega Evolution, your turn ends. Its first and only attack costs a Fairy and 2 colorless, Brilliant Arrow. It does 30 damage times the amount of Fairy energy attached to all of your Pokemon. This card can turn into a beast late game, with some setup from max elixirs and some basics to take the active while it sets up. But getting there might be more of a pain than playing something like Seismitoad, which also stomps this card if it takes too long to get ready. It also hurts being a Mega, making Tool cards a non-starter for it, due to the reliance on Spirit Link. Still, I don't want to rag on this too hard. It still made for a perfectly fine deck in its day. It just didn't top many things in the years that it was around. Before we get to the next Mega, we have one non-EX card for this generation. Gardevoir from Ancient Origins is a 130 HP Fairy type that brings back the Stage 2 to Gardevoir. Its ability, Bright Heal. Once per turn, before you attack, you may heal 20 damage from each of your Pokemon. Its first and only attack for 3 colorless is Telekinesis. This attack does 50 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon. This attack damage isn't affected by weakness or resistance. Okay, someone should tell the Pokemon Company that they accidentally got a card from 2005 stuck in the set from 10 years later. Seriously though, this is pretty bad. Healing 20 damage is even less relevant than the last time Gardy could do it, and it wasn't too relevant then. 50 damage to the bench would be good if it was for 2 energy on a basic, not for 3 on a stage 2, which also makes this card laughable. Enjoy your Ralts getting curb stomped by a Darkrai while you try to put this thing on the board. Moving on. Gardevoir EX from Steam Siege. It's a 170 basic Fairy type with the EX rule. Its first attack for a Fairy and a colorless, Link Blast, does 30 and also states if this Pokemon and your opponent's active Pokemon have the same amount of energy attached to them, this does 70 more damage. Its second attack, for 2 Fairies and 1 colorless, Luminous Blade, does 120 damage. Discard an energy attached to this Pokemon. The first attack is actually pretty great for early turn plays when both Pokemon are setting up, and you're likely to hit 100 damage more than you'd think thanks to the plethora of attackers running around with 2+ energy attached to them. Luminous Blade is okay, but you probably won't be getting to that energy count before Mega Evolving into our next card. Mega Gardevoir EX from Steam Siege. It's a 210 HP, Psychic and Fairy type Pokemon. It has the EX rule and the Mega rule. Its attack for a Fairy and a colorless, Despair Ray, does 110 damage. Discard as many of your benched Pokemon as you'd like, and this attack does 10 more damage for each bench Pokemon you discarded in this way. This was part of many decks that topped big events over the years, and basically defined Fairies as a type. 210 for 2 energy is pretty great, and the ability to knock Pokemon off your bench was incredibly helpful in the land of Shaman that was 2016. Hitting for weakness on a Psychic Pokemon is also amazing, as being able to bop them while they're still hitting you neutrally is great, but also means that the ever-popular Darkrai EX could take your attacks with a -20 resist rather than being neutral. While it wasn't a tier 0 deck, it was still strong as hell, and able to compete with the top decks of the format. A great card and a great end for Gardy in Gen 6. Moving on to the 7th generation and GX Pokemon, we have Gardevoir GX from Burning Shadows. It's a 230 HP, Stage 2 Fairy type. It has the GX rule, which is the same as the EX rule. Its ability, Secret Spring, once per turn, before you attack, you may attach a fairy energy from your hand to one of your Pokemon. Its first attack, Infinite Force, does 30 damage times the amount of energy attached to both active Pokemon. Its GX attack, Fairy Twilight GX, allows you to shuffle 10 cards from your discard pile into your deck. You can't use more than one GX attack per game. The energy acceleration on this card is amazing and goes wonderfully with its attack. It can become an impressively massive attacker when you get 2 Guardies up and running. This deck actually won Worlds in a format where Gardevoir's item lock was rampant, showing that even without rare candy, the deck can still function reasonably well. It's beefy enough to sponge hits and hit back for astronomical damage. It can be slow to set up, and the drawback of needing a lot of energy attached to one Pokemon that could get knocked out, leaving you high and dry, are obvious. But the results speak for themselves. This deck saw a lot of play up until its rotation, where it relied on Swampert's power draw to get the energy and rare candies in hand. This would be Guardy's only solo GX, but it's a damn good one. We now return to one prize attackers with Gardevoir from Lost Thunder. It's a 130 HP, Stage 2 Fairy type. For 1 Fairy energy, Brilliant Search, search your deck up to 3 cards and put them in your hand, then shuffle your deck. Its next attack, for a Fairy and 2 colorless, Sensitive Ray, does 70 damage, and if you played a supporter card from your hand during your turn, this attack does 90 more damage. I'm torn on this one. On one hand, as a tech choice for the Gardevoir GX decks, this could be viable. Sensitive Ray, other than being a really weird name for an attack, is a good attack on a non-GX, and since you're likely to play supporter from your hand every turn, it means that you're probably going to be consistently hitting for 160 for 3 Fairy energy. Slap a choice band on and accelerate some energy onto this bad boy. You've got KOs on most non-GXs, while only giving up 1 prize. However, the fact that it's a Stage 2 makes it way harder to justify now that the old GX is rotated, and 160 just ain't cutting it with these thick tag team boys running around. Being a Stage 2 also means searching any 3 cards is basically pointless at that point. If you have to use this on your second or third turn, you've probably got a Pikarom that's already knocked out your bench's Ralts. This card is a pretty good example of how rotation and power creep can ruin the potential of a card before it ever really had a chance to shine. And being Stage 2 doesn't help. Lastly, we have another Fairy Pokemon sharing the spotlight with our old friend, Gardevoir and Sylveon GX from Unbroken Bonds. It's a 260 HP Fairy-type Tag Team Pokemon. It has the Tag Team GX rule, where when it's knocked out, your opponent takes 3 prizes. For 1 colorless, Fairy Song allows you to search your deck for up to 2 Fairy energies and attach them to your benched Pokemon in any way you like. Then shuffle your deck. Its second attack, Kaleidostorm, for 2 Fairies and 1 colorless, does 150 damage. It then states you can move any number of energies from your Pokemon to another Pokemon in any way you like. Its GX attack, Magical Miracle, for a minimum of 3 Fairy, does 200. If this Pokemon has at least 3 extra Fairy energy attached to it, in addition to the attack's cost, your opponent shuffles their hand into their deck. You can't use more than 1 GX attack per game. It's hard to talk about Guardian without mentioning Fairy Charms, items that make you impervious to GX of almost every relevant type. This basically makes Guardian the perfect meta counter to a lot of top-tier meta decks, and the ability to attach energy to the second Guardian, if you go second, is a great way to get powered up. Well, it's the only way for Fairy types, but whatever. And moving around the energy with Kaleidostorm after dealing enough to 2-hit KO anything is amazing, as it facilitates tagging out one Guardian for another if you get too much damage on you. On top of that, Magical Miracle GX can outright win you games on its own. Worlds this year is flooded with Guardian, trying to counter things like Pikarom and Mew Mew. But the problem comes when you can't hit Fairy Charms. You need to get the right ones, and considering most people only run 2, or worse, run into Lysander's labs without deactivating them, means that you can get knocked out by some of the harder hitting tag teams, with healing basically being down to a super scoop up and a great potion. However, this card only seems to be getting better and better as the meta progresses. We'll see how it fares in the land of V Pokemon, when its Fairy Charms aren't going to be working too well. but as it stands right now, it's a great card in a very competitive meta. So looking back on the history of Gardevoir cards, it's easy to see why people say that she's had the most successful career out of any Pokemon in the TCG. Still, something I've noticed in a lot of these cards is that many of them were successful counters to their metagame, and not necessarily dominating it. Between the ability locks of Gen 3, the control aspects of Gen 4, even today, with the Fairy Charm-centric builds of her tag team, Gardevoir rarely seems to have a stranglehold on the metagame, but always seems to have a presence in it. And I think that's pretty cool. How will Gardevoir fare in Sword and Shield? We'll just have to find out. But if history's any indication, I'm sure she'll do just fine. Also, there's this other Gardevoir card that just came out in Japan and probably isn't going to get localized here anytime soon. It's pretty bad, so I'm not going to talk about it because this video is long enough as it is. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed watching.